So my name is Matt Dryhurst. I'm, I guess, primarily a musician. I perform and record with my partner Holly Herndon. And I also am a teacher, so I teach at New York University in the music department, the Clive Davis Institute. And on top of that, I also release artworks and software that has a conceptual, critical angle, I guess, to it.
So before we already talked about that, and also in the discussions and panels, you think about music and tech. Like, what is your main thought, I would say, in 2017 about music and tech?
Sure. So what we talked about a lot on the panel tonight, and one thing I'm principally interested in, is understanding under the conditions of platform capitalism. So we live in a new era of platform capitalism where a certain minority of large transnational companies are dictating the way in which we interact with each other and the way in which we transact, and are, determining new markets for things. What does it mean to be independent within that new ecosystem? And so a lot of the projects that I'm involved with, also with my partner making music, but also making software, are trying to ask this question of saying, well, where are we in this new ecosystem? What agency do we have? What affordances does this new ecosystem offer us to experiment and to expand the medium of music beyond simply just making some tracks that can slot into a playlist on Spotify, which personally is very boring and disinteresting to me. So just as the original independent pioneers created a whole independent ethos and ecosystem through which to distribute their music and create subcultures, many of which have been subsumed into the greater kind of mainstream today, what would a similar effort be for young musicians now? What would it mean if? What does it mean to deviate? What does it mean to experiment in these conditions when most of the things that have happened, most of the things you can do to a sound have already kind of happened?
And how can I experiment? What is one example for experimenting?
So, for me, it's mostly at this point, because of the dominance of a small group of platform monopolies, the experimentation largely falls on how the delivery mechanisms by which you choose to express yourself. So what I said earlier in the panel, one thing I find really interesting is, the original independent record distribution infrastructure was a very limited medium, right? You had a piece of wax in a square box that you sent around the world. How is it that today you have fewer opportunities to customize the way people experience your music than you used to do with a piece of wax that used to be shipped? How is that possible? It's because, your Spotifys and your iTunes have basically turned whole subcultures, whole legacies, whole local communities into a library of, it's a Walmart of thumbnails and track listings with barely any reference to where this music comes from, who paid for it, what label infrastructure made it possible, right? So thinking about those questions and asking yourself how you can deviate in these digital environments is super interesting to me. I developed a system, for example, an experimental system called Saga, which is an embed publishing system, open source embed publishing system that allows for musicians to publish, self-host their work, publish it online, and then change each version of their work that appears online. For example, as a way of speculating on an experimental distribution system that might actually lead to some very, very interesting outcomes. So the idea being that if Pitchfork posts a song of mine and it's posted next to a Nike advertisement, I can change the song to comment on the Nike advertisement if I want. I can also charge Pitchfork 10 times more than anybody else because I noticed that it was on the Pitchfork site. So it basically gives artists all of the tools that advertisers use in order to track where their ads go and change those ads in relation to where they land. And it's something I call website-specific performance, right? So this is one example of a framework that is actually not that technically complex, but if you think about the implications of a large group of people using such a framework, things start getting really interesting because it brings up questions like, is it possible to sell advertising next to work that can disavow it? Is it possible to run a newspaper or a magazine based on advertising if the embeds that you post on your website might all of a sudden rebel on you, right? So in my mind, taking more control of what you do and thinking about what you do and thinking outside of the design frameworks that have been provided to you by platform monopolies or even the software that you use is one way of deviating, and from that and through that we get to a better place. And I don't know exactly what that is, but that's interesting to me. hearing another indie rock record that sounds like 1986 is not interesting to me.
But it sounds a little like you see all those platforms like Spotify, Apple, iTunes, etc. As an enemy.
Sure. Sounds like that, doesn't it?
It does sound like it.
Yeah, for me, I mean, the thing is, I know people that work at these platforms. It's a more complicated issue. They've also provided certain functionalities that didn't exist before that. Particularly,
for example?
Well, for SoundCloud, for example, like having an easily embeddable player that looks good, that all of a sudden people can follow you in certain environments. This didn't really exist before. I mean, MySpace kind of existed, but they did a really good job. There's really smart, good people at SoundCloud, many of whom I know and call friends. But in the grander scheme of things, if we talk about infrastructure as an issue that has hard aesthetic implications, that influences the kind of music that appears on stages, which in turn also influences the kind of discussions that we have around culture, which in turn also, influences society at large and politics at large, then yeah, I think that the way in which they deal with music, I think that the way in which shareholder-driven kind of huge markets for music that don't take into consideration the origins of where the music came from and that actually limit the opportunities for artists to express themselves and feel agency within their network, I think they're a problem, and ultimately I do think they're the enemy. But I speak with them regularly. But for me, and particularly the legacy of the musical culture and the just general, like the philosophical or ideological culture I come from, I think we can do a lot better. And I'm surprised that there aren't more people deviating and experimenting outside of those networks. To a certain extent, you also have to participate with them. I understand this. Most people have to use some form of service even for their job. But the more that you begin thinking about these platform monopolies, the more you begin understanding how you are imprisoned by them to a certain extent. You have to participate in them because you're not going to get a job otherwise, or you're not going to, So when it comes to culture and when it comes to music, I very much protect the impetus and the spirit of people within these marginal subcultural traditions to make enemies of the dominant platforms that run society. I think we ought to make enemies of them, or at least be very, very critical.
But do you use them for your own music?
We're contractually obliged to use Spotify. We're contractually obliged to use many of the services. So yes.
Because you're signed.
Yes, exactly. So we're signed to a label and are contractually obliged to participate in them. So yes and no, in the sense that I don't personally. I mean, you can't escape them. If you're reading an article and you press on a SoundCloud player or something like this, yeah, of course, everyone uses them. How can you not use them? But in terms of like participating in them and investing faith and love or whatever into them, I don't. But that's me. I'm very much a weirdo in terms of that. Yes.
But still, you're teaching. Last question, I guess. You're still teaching to students how to survive as a musician.
Yes.
And in my opinion, it's like very important, especially if you're small, to be on those platforms, like on Spotify, SoundCloud, wherever you can be, right?
Oh, thank you.
Take two. You're speaker. You can take more.
Oh, thanks. Thank you.
Was ist das?
Das ist ein Getränkebox. Sorry.
Ich hätte das beinahe gegessen.
It's not. I'm not giving out drugs.
Also, ja,
it's a drink ticket for where we are all going to the networking area when we leave this room.
Okay.
So to repeat your question, when teaching students, is it not in their interests as small developing artists to participate in Spotify? Sure, they know that. Right, and so we can discuss that quite openly. I would never expect someone out of pure ideology to make themselves homeless or whatever. But here's the thing, they aren't making any money from them. And even if they found success through them, they wouldn't make any money from them. So actually, technically, they're not really losing anything through not participating in them. This idea of an economy of looks, the economy of eyes, of an economy of abstracted ears that exists somewhere out there, that somehow through some magical alchemy will turn into a career, let's see. 70% of the money in the music industry goes to the top 1% of people. Right? And there's a lot invested in, and most people casually listening to Spotify are listening to the Beatles back catalogue or a Michael Jackson record or whatever else they paid exorbitant amounts of money to be on there. This idea of making your living or having to participate in these networks, I think, is actually overblown. But that being said, I would not dissuade someone from participating in them, because when you're a young artist, absolutely, you must keep open all available opportunities. But the thing I would say to a young artist who's particularly curious about my line of thinking is if you were to define yourself in opposition to these, you might actually make a product that people want to pay for. And this is the bigger thing, is you're training people through participating in these networks to say, well, this doesn't matter. It's like I listen, I consume thousands of records a month. What the fuck's the difference? No. If you are producing something of value that you believe in, that represents something that a greater community than yourself, I'd behoove younger people to think, how could I make this somewhat different? Because just as with the original independent music industry, there are always markets for something different. But first you have to define how and why it is different. And right now, show me the person that's making money off Spotify. Because I know a lot of professional musicians, and I'm telling you, very few are. So, so by all means, I wouldn't dissuade anyone from ever, from pushing themselves in a corner and like becoming a hermit. Or I'm not a Luddite in this sense, but there are technological options available. To make better decisions that might actually turn into some source of income. You never know. But I do know that with these existing services, they're not turning into sources of income. So why would I be loyal to them?
So surviving as an artist, I have to do something special.
Sure.
That's pretty much it.
I hope so. Yeah. I mean, there's all kinds of artists. I don't know, but one would hope that the art market would incentivize people who are doing special things. Which is another argument to say with the playlist culture of Spotify, I actually think that it incentivizes people to do quite boring things. And maybe that's also a problem. But yeah, in my understanding of like an ideal art or music market, people are encouraged to do special things. Absolutely. That's in my logic, that's the reason for its existence, But not everyone might agree with me on that.
Cool. Thank you very much for your time.
I'm very happy. I look forward to listening.